The moment Kang Junwoo realized he was in trouble had nothing to do with a rival's threat or a deal gone wrong. It happened at 9:14 on a Thursday evening in the ballroom of the Grand Hyatt Seoul, with a glass of single malt scotch in his hand, and his wife laughing 20 feet away from him. She was laughing at something Daniel Park had said. Her head tilted back slightly, her hand coming up to cover her mouth the way it did when something genuinely caught her off guard. The sound carried across the polished marble floor and landed somewhere in Junwoo's chest like a stone breaking water. He had been married to Maya Bennett for 8 months. 8 months of shared walls and separate silences. 8 months of meals she prepared that he barely acknowledged, of mornings she greeted him in that quiet, careful way of hers, and evenings where he walked past her like she was furniture he'd grown too used to seeing. He had never once heard her laugh like that. Not once. Not in 8 months of living under the same roof, of sitting across the same dinner table on the rare evenings he came home at a decent hour, of riding in the same car to family functions exactly like this one. He knew her other laugh, the warm, composed one she used with his cousins and his grandmother. He had catalogued it from a careful distance the way he catalogued most things, without allowing himself to examine why he was paying that much attention at all. This was different. This was unguarded. This was a woman who had stopped thinking about how she appeared to the room and was simply, completely, inside the moment someone had given her. It lasted only a few seconds. But those seconds were enough to understand, with a clarity he was not prepared for, that he had been looking at Maya Bennett for 8 months and had never once actually seen her. The glass in his hand tightened. His lieutenant, Shin, said something into his ear about the Busan shipment. Junwoo didn't hear a word of it. To understand how they got here, you have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning, like most things that define your life, started with a woman he could not say no to. Park Sun-ae was 81 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and the only person on earth who could make Kang Junwoo sit still. She had raised him after his parents died, built him from grief and stubbornness into something that resembled a man, and loved him with a ferocity that bordered on violence. He would burn Seoul to the ground for her. She knew it. She used it. "I have found you a wife," she said one afternoon, seated across from him in her garden with the particular calm of someone delivering devastating news. She was drinking barley tea. He was watching her the way you watch something fragile that you know eventually will break. Halmiani. His voice was controlled. Everything about Junwoo was controlled. "We've discussed this. You discussed. I listened. Now I'm speaking. I'm 34 years old. I don't need. You need someone who will still be there when I'm not." She set her cup down and looked at him in the direct, unhurried way of someone who had long since stopped having time for anything that was not the truth. "I'm not asking you to fall in love with her. I'm asking you to try." The name she gave him was Maya Bennett. American, 28, had been living in Seoul for 3 years, teaching art history at a private university. She had met his grandmother through a cultural exchange program where volunteers visited elderly residents. They had apparently been meeting for tea every Thursday for over a year. His grandmother spoke of her the way she spoke of summer, warmly, as though her presence was something inevitable and good. Junwoo formed his opinion before he ever set eyes on her. A foreign woman, young, clever enough to make herself indispensable to a wealthy old woman. He knew the calculation. He had spent 15 years in a world built entirely on calculation. He recognized it anywhere. He pictured someone strategic. Someone who had identified a lonely elderly woman and made herself indispensable with quiet, deliberate intention. The thought made him guarded before they had exchanged 20 words. It made him certain of things he had no business being certain about. He was wrong about almost everything. He would not discover this for 8 months. The wedding took place at a private estate in Gangnam on a Saturday in October, when the maples outside had just begun to turn. The ceremony was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, immaculate, deliberate, designed to impress. Maya wore a deep ivory dress that skimmed her collarbone and pooled at her feet. Her natural hair was pinned up with small gold pins. When she walked down the aisle, several of his cousins exchanged glances. Even Shin, who was constitutionally incapable of sentiment, looked twice. Junwoo did not look twice. He looked once, confirmed she was there, and returned his gaze to the officiant. He told himself this was professionalism. A business arrangement did not require admiration. He was doing his grandmother a favor. Nothing more. The vows were exchanged. The officiant announced them husband and wife. Junwoo shook the officiant's hand, turned to the assembled guests, and said, quietly and without drama, that he had an urgent matter to attend to. Before Maya had fully registered what was happening, he had left the altar. No reception, no first dance, no photographs. His grandmother watched him leave with an expression that held grief and patience in equal measure. She understood that the boy she had raised was afraid of things he didn't have words for yet. She had raised him to be strong. She had not, in her grief, taught him to be soft. Maya stood at the altar, bouquet still in her hands, and the understanding settled into her bones rather than her brain. The kind that does not require processing because it arrives already complete. This was not a marriage. This was a sentence. The guests whispered. The sound moved through the room in a wave she could not stop, only stand still and let pass over her. An older aunt appeared at her side, efficient, quietly kind in the practiced way of someone managing a situation, and guided her toward the reception hall before the whispers could build into something she could not contain. She sat at the head table for 4 hours. She ate the food placed in front of her. She smiled through 7 toasts, one of which was directed specifically at her, and when a cousin she had not yet met raised his glass and said something warm and generous on her behalf, she smiled and said thank you with such composure that the woman seated beside her touched her arm and said, "You're handling this beautifully." Maya had thanked her for that too. She had been completely, entirely alone the whole time. No one watching would have known. She did not cry. Not yet. She was saving that for later, for the car ride through the lit streets of a city that did not know or care what kind of day she'd had. Sitting in the back seat while quiet music played and the driver kept his eyes forward and soul moved past the windows like it always did, indifferent and bright. You want to know if she considered leaving? The answer is yes. Every rational part of her said to go. But Maya Bennett had agreed to this marriage for one reason alone. She had watched Park Sun-ae cry when she begged her to stay. The old woman had taken both of her hands across a tea-house table in Insadong and said, "He is not a bad man. He is a frightened one. I am asking you to be brave enough for both of you until he remembers how." Maya was not in love with Junwoo. She barely knew him, but she loved Sun-ae in the way you love someone who sees you fully and holds the sight gently. And so she stayed. What she didn't know, what no one had told her, was that she had written 3 letters refusing this marriage before finally relenting. That she had argued, pleaded, and ultimately surrendered not out of desire but out of compassion. That the final letter she sent before agreeing contained the line, "I don't want to marry a man who clearly doesn't want me. But if you truly believe this will make him whole, I will try. Not for him, for you." Junwoo never read those letters. His grandmother had kept them, folded neatly, in the drawer of her writing desk. He would find them eventually. By then, it would almost be too late. The Kong family mansion sat behind iron gates in a quiet neighborhood in Yongsan, surrounded by pine trees that held their shape through every season. It was the kind of house designed to communicate power without announcing it, understated and immovable. Maya arrived on a Sunday evening with 2 suitcases and a carefully neutral expression. In the entrance hall, Mrs. O, the housekeeper, a woman in her late 50s with a watchful, composed face, was waiting. She introduced herself and the 2 other members of household staff alongside her. Mr. Beck, the groundskeeper, and Ji-yun, who managed the family's scheduling. They were polite, careful. The way people are careful when they don't yet know where you fall in the hierarchy of the house and who they are supposed to protect. Mrs. O showed her upstairs to her room. Her room, not their room. She had expected that. What she hadn't expected was the view from the window, the courtyard garden below, lanterns strung between the pine trees, the needles catching the last amber light of evening. She stood at the glass and breathed. "Okay," she told herself. "You can do this. You've survived harder things." She had. That was the quiet truth about Maya that people only discovered slowly. She did not break easily. She bent, absorbed the impact and kept standing. It was not toughness. It was something more specific, the kind of resilience that comes from having already rebuilt yourself once and knowing, with a certainty that lives in the body rather than the mind, that you could do it again. She unpacked both suitcases, set 3 books on the nightstand, placed her speaker on the dresser, put a small framed photograph on the windowsill. Her mother, mid-laugh, caught by someone who loved her, at a beach somewhere in the Carolinas. She positioned it facing the garden, so her mother could see the lanterns. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and was still for a moment. Just still. Junwoo returned home at 11 that night. She heard the front door. Heard his footsteps cross the entrance hall below. Heard them slow, just slightly, the way footsteps slow when a body registers something without the mind giving it permission, as they passed her room where she had left the light on, where any decent person would have knocked, or at least paused. The footsteps continued. His door closed at the far end of the hall. The light under her door burned for another hour before she reached over and turned it off. This is where it starts. Not with violence. Not with cruelty. With something quieter and more devastating than either. With a closed door and a woman on the other side of it learning, in real time, exactly what kind of marriage she had entered. If you have ever left a light on for someone who never came, if you know the specific quiet loneliness of being looked through by the one person whose sight would have meant something, then you already know where this story is going. And you already know it is going to cost him everything before he understands what he had. Subscribe right now and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Because what happens next is the kind of thing that stays with you long after the story ends. The first month, Maya told herself it was an adjustment period. He was a private man. He had not chosen this. She would give him space and time, and eventually the ice would shift. This was the hopeful story she told herself while she learned the rhythms of the house around him. When he woke, what he drank in the mornings, which rooms he moved through and which he avoided, the specific silence he carried differently depending on whether he was working through something or simply choosing not to speak. She prepared breakfast every morning. Not because it was expected of her, not because Mrs. O couldn't have done it, but because it was the only thing she could think of that might create a moment. Some small, ordinary moment where he might sit across from her and remember she was a person. She learned he drank barley tea before anything else, the same as his grandmother. She learned he didn't eat much in the mornings, just something light. She learned to have it ready at 6:45, when he came downstairs. She would set the table, pour his tea, leave a small plate beside it, and then step back. Not hovering, just present. Available. The way you make yourself available to someone who might, if the conditions were right, decide to let you in. He would pour his tea, scan the table, eat a few bites standing at the counter, and leave. Some mornings she tried. A quiet good morning as he came in. A question about whether he needed anything before she left the kitchen. He answered, when he answered at all, without looking up. Without pausing. Without any indication that the sound of her voice registered as something requiring more than the minimum. She would say, okay, then have a good day, and he would already be walking away. He never sat. He never looked at her directly for more than a second. If she spoke, he answered in monosyllables or not at all. And still, every morning she set the table. Because she had made a promise, and because she was not yet ready to admit that the promise might cost more than she had calculated when she made it. In the second month, she started visiting Sune-e in the afternoons. The old woman's rooms were on the east side of the mansion, warm and cluttered with photographs and small ceramic figurines and stacks of books she was always in the middle of. Sune-e received her every day like a gift, the door already opening before Maya finished knocking, the face arranged into something that resembled relief. They would drink tea and talk about everything, art, history, the peculiar stubbornness of Korean men, the particular freedom of choosing to love someone even when they made it difficult. He's not ignoring you because he dislikes you, Sune-e said once, peering at Maya over the rim of her cup. He's ignoring you because he's afraid of what happens if he doesn't. That's a kind interpretation, Maya said. It's an accurate one. He spent his whole life learning to hold things at a distance. If something gets close, he doesn't know what to do with it. Maya looked out the window at the garden below. He could try learning. He will. Sune-e's voice held the certainty of someone who had already seen further into the future than either of them. The question is whether you'll still be here when he does. Maya turned the cup in her hands and did not answer. Not because she didn't have one, but because the honest answer was that she wasn't sure, and she was not yet ready to say that to the woman who had staked something significant on her staying. In the third month, his cousins started coming around. Junwoo had 3, all younger, all loud in the particular way of people who had grown up in a house with walls thick enough to absorb anything. The eldest, Hyun-suk, was 26 and constitutionally incapable of awkwardness. He arrived for dinner one evening, took one look at Maya setting the table, and stopped in the doorway. "Oh," he said, "she's real. I thought maybe Junhyung made her up." "I'm real," Maya confirmed. "He never mentioned you," Hyun-suk said, not as an accusation, more as a statement that seemed to embarrass him on his cousin's behalf. "Not once. Not even to say he'd gotten married. I heard from my mother. At a family lunch. 3 weeks after the wedding." Maya absorbed this without changing her expression. "That sounds about right," she said pleasantly. "Sit down. There's plenty." By the end of that dinner, Hyun-suk had decided Maya was the best thing that had ever happened to the Kang family. He texted the other 2 cousins that same night. Within a week, all 3 were appearing regularly for meals, asking her opinions, teaching her card games she had no intention of mastering but played anyway, arguing with cheerful intensity about which of them she liked best, as though her preference was a prize worth competing for. She remembered the things they mentioned in passing. That Hyun-suk's thesis supervisor had been making his life difficult. That the middle cousin, Jisoo, had been trying for months to learn a particular card trick. That the youngest Jisoo was nervous about presenting his new business proposal to the family's investment board for the first time, though he was pretending otherwise. She asked about these things at exactly the right moments, without making a production of remembering. She just remembered, because that is what you do when people matter to you. It was Hyun-suk who eventually said something to Jun-woo directly. He waited until Maya had stepped into the kitchen, then turned to his cousin without bothering to lower his voice. "You know what your problem is?" he said. "Last Tuesday she sat with us for 3 hours. She remembered that I'd mentioned my thesis supervisor once in passing 2 weeks ago, and she asked about him by name. She remembered that Jisoo was nervous about presenting his new business proposal to the investment board, and she had quietly left a detailed outline of talking points on the kitchen counter that morning without saying a word about it to anyone. She made doenjang jjigae from scratch because she overheard Grandma mention she was craving it. He paused, letting that land. "You walked through that kitchen 4 times while she was cooking. 4 times. You didn't say one word to her. Not one." Jun-woo turned a page of the document he was reading and said nothing. Hyun-suk looked at Maya, who had reappeared in the doorway, and shrugged with the quiet resignation of someone who has done what he could. Maya smiled back. This had already become their system. Hyun-suk attempting the impossible, the 2 of them acknowledging without words that it hadn't worked, moving on. The household staff adored her quietly and in their own particular ways. Mrs. O started leaving small things without explanation. A specific brand of tea she had overheard Maya mention once. A scarf folded on the counter when the weather dropped without warning. Mr. Beck began cutting flowers from the courtyard garden and leaving them on the kitchen counter, knowing she would arrange them in the rooms the way she liked. Differently from how they had always been done, but better. Ji-yeon started asking her opinion on things outside her role, household scheduling, the weekly menu, because Maya was good at it and because being consulted feels like belonging, and belonging was something Maya was quietly hungry for in a way she hadn't yet fully said out loud. Everyone in that house saw her. Everyone except the man whose name she now carried. It is a particular kind of loneliness, being invisible to the one person whose sight would have meant something. Not dramatic. Not the kind of loneliness you cry about openly. The kind that settles into the daily routine like sediment, layer by quiet layer, until one day you reach for something and realize you've been holding yourself slightly braced for months, waiting for a knock on a door that was never going to come. The waiting, she understood slowly, had become its own kind of exhaustion. Not the loud kind. The quiet, accumulating kind that builds in the space between small hopeful moments and the silence that always followed them. Maya hit that day in the 5th month. She woke on a Tuesday and lay in bed for 20 extra minutes looking at the ceiling, and somewhere in that stillness something shifted. Not broke, shifted, like a lock disengaging from the inside. She had been working so hard, the breakfasts, the notes she left on the counter about his schedule, the evenings she stayed up later than she needed to because some stubborn part of her still believed that if she was simply present enough, visible enough, eventually he would choose to see her. She was tired. Not in the way sleep fixes. The deeper kind. The kind that comes from pouring steadily into something that never fills. She got up. She got dressed. She did not go downstairs to prepare his breakfast. She went to her desk instead and opened the research paper she had been neglecting for 2 weeks, and she worked on it with the focused, quiet intensity of someone who has remembered, without fanfare, without announcement, that she exists entirely outside of another person's indifference. Downstairs, Junwoo came to the kitchen at 6:45. The tea was not made. The counter was bare. Mrs. O was not yet downstairs. He stood in the kitchen in the particular stillness of a man whose body has arrived somewhere it expected to find something and found nothing instead. He stood there a moment longer than made sense. Then he made his own tea. He stood at the counter and drank it alone and told himself it meant nothing. He lied to himself well. He had years of practice. But something in the house felt different that morning, and he could not name what it was, and that namelessness bothered him in a way he would spend the next 3 weeks pretending it didn't. The notes stopped. The late lights under her door stopped. At family gatherings, Maya arrived, participated with grace, and at the end of the evening said her goodbyes to Sun-ae and the cousins and walked to the car without looking to see if Junwoo was following. He always followed, but she stopped checking. If you have ever been the person who kept giving until the day you simply couldn't anymore, you know what this moment cost her. You know the specific weight of finally choosing yourself after months of choosing someone who never chose you back. And you know something else too. The exact moment someone stops trying is almost always the exact moment the person they were trying for begins to feel the cold. Junwoo felt it. He just hadn't admitted it yet. He would be forced to when Daniel Park walked into a charity gala on a Friday evening in March and spent 45 minutes talking to Maya like she was the most interesting person in the room. Which, if Junwoo had been paying any attention at all in 6 months, he would have already known she was. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what happens at that gala is about to change everything for both of them. The charity event was connected to a foundation that several of Junwoo's business associates funded. Art accessibility programs, restored cultural sites, scholarship grants for young Korean artists. The kind of evening that required the right people to be present and the right things to be said in the right rooms. Maya attended because it was expected of her and because, increasingly, she had stopped organizing her evenings around what Junwoo might prefer and started organizing them around what she might actually want. And she cared genuinely about the foundation's work. She had spoken to the director twice before about a partnership with her university's department. She wore something she had bought for herself the previous month. A deep green dress, structured at the shoulder, that she had chosen without consulting anyone's opinion. Her jewelry was gold and simple. She had stopped wearing the elaborate pieces left in her room in those first weeks. Gifts from Sun-ae that she suspected Junwoo had purchased on instruction without personal involvement. She arrived in the car with Junwoo, as they always did to these things, side by side, a careful 18 inches between them, saying nothing for 20 minutes while the city slid past the windows. This was not discomfort anymore. This was just their architecture. She had stopped expecting conversation on these drives months ago and had learned to use the silence productively, reviewing the names of people she wanted to speak with, organizing the points she wanted to raise with the director, arriving already settled into herself rather than unsettled by him. Junwoo's phone rang as the car pulled up. He answered it before the door opened, stepping out with 2 fingers raised at her in a gesture that managed to communicate both "go ahead" and "I'll find you later" without his eyes ever quite landing on her face. She went in alone. She was used to this. In the beginning it had cost her something. Walking into these rooms by herself while everyone quietly registered what the empty space beside her meant. Now she walked in like she owned her own entrance because she had learned, slowly through repetition, that no one else was going to do it for her. Inside, the ballroom glittered. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, found the foundation director and finally locked down the university partnership meeting she had been trying to secure for 2 months. Then made small talk with 2 women from the art council, whom she recognized from a previous event. She was good at this, being present, being warm, asking the right questions. It was one of the things about herself she had rediscovered in these months of largely solo social navigation. She had always been good with people. Junwoo had simply not been in a position to notice. "You're the one doing research on Joseon-era textile art, aren't you?" The voice came from her left. She turned. The man standing there was Korean, mid-30s, with the particular ease of someone who had never needed to perform confidence because it had simply always been there. Not arrogance, something quieter than that. He was dressed simply for an event like this, jacket over a dark shirt, no tie. He was holding a glass of still water rather than champagne. "I've read 2 of your papers," he continued, and his tone was not flattery, It was the matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating a thing they found interesting. The one on court dress symbolism and the newer one on regional weaving variations. I'm in architecture, but I spent 3 years focusing on historic preservation. The overlap with your research area is significant. Maya looked at him. You read academic papers on Josian textiles for fun? I read anything that makes me better at my job. Something like a smile. Daniel Park. Maya Bennett. She shook his hand. I know who you are, he said simply. I saw your presentation at the Cultural Symposium last year. You were the best speaker there, and you were on at 9 in the morning, which is an unfair time slot for anyone. She laughed. The unguarded kind. The kind that comes when something genuinely catches you. The early slot is always punishment for submitting your abstract late. Is that what happened? Every single time. They talked for 45 minutes without stopping. He was easy to talk to in a way that had nothing to do with romantic intent. Just the specific pleasure of someone who listened properly, who picked up threads from 20 minutes ago and returned to them, who asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he'd actually heard the answer to the first one. He remembered that she'd mentioned a particular archival collection she'd been trying to access. He knew the director of that archive personally and offered to make an introduction with the offhand generosity of someone for whom networking is a form of civic participation rather than leverage. You don't have to do that, Maya said. I know, Daniel said. It's not a favor. It's just useful. 45 minutes. 45 minutes of someone treating her like a person whose mind and work and presence were worth his full attention. It should not have been enough to mean something. But after 8 months of the specific deprivation she had been living through, it meant something. She became aware of this slowly, the way you become aware of warmth when you have been cold for so long you forgot what warmth was supposed to feel like. Not attraction. Something simpler and in some ways more devastating, the recognition of what it felt like to stand in a conversation and not brace yourself for the moment the other person stopped caring. She had forgotten that feeling was available to her. That she was the kind of person someone could find genuinely interesting if they simply bothered to look. Across the ballroom, Junwoo had finished his call and come inside. He had a drink in his hand and he was shaking hands with the right people, saying the right things, functioning with the precise social efficiency that made him formidable in every room he entered. He found Maya in under 3 minutes. This was automatic. Locating her in a crowd was something his body did without instruction, though he had not yet examined what this meant. What he found stopped him mid-step. Maya Bennett was laughing, really laughing, beside a man he didn't recognize, standing close to him, comfortable in a way Junwoo had never once seen her be comfortable with anyone. He stopped moving. He had been watching her for 8 months from a deliberate distance, cataloging the edges of her existence the way you catalog something you've decided not to engage with. He knew her laugh, the polite one, the warm one she used with his cousins and his grandmother. He had never seen this one, the one where something actually surprised her, where her whole face changed because the surprise reached her properly. Something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the ballroom's air conditioning. He was aware, suddenly and acutely, of the precise distance between himself and the man standing beside his wife. The easy, comfortable 2 feet of space that meant neither of them was bracing against the other. He had seen Maya maintain careful, deliberate distance from every person in every room she entered since she arrived at the Kong mansion. She was not maintaining careful distance from this man. He crossed the room at an even pace. He was not rushing. He was absolutely rushing. Maya! His voice came out more controlled than he felt. She turned, and he watched the laugh fade. Not into unhappiness, just into the careful neutral expression she had learned to wear around him. Something about that transition, from that open, unguarded laugh to that composed blankness, hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. It was the speed of it that did it. The way she armored herself the moment she saw him, as though his presence required a specific kind of bracing. He had done that. He had trained her face to do that around him. And seeing it here, in contrast to what it had been a moment before, made the knowledge land differently than it ever had. Junwoo. She was perfectly composed. This is Daniel Park. He's an architect with a focus on historic preservation. We were just talking about the Josian collection at the Kong Junwoo, Daniel said, extending his hand. Easy, unhurried, zero evidence of intimidation, which Junwoo found mildly offensive. I've heard of your family's contributions to several restoration projects. Significant work. Junwoo shook the hand. He smiled the smile he used professionally. Are you connected to the foundation? I've consulted on 3 of their preservation projects. Your wife's research has actually informed some of our approach to material authenticity in restoration work. Your wife. He said it naturally without emphasis as pure information. And somehow the naturalness of it bothered Junwoo more than any pointed comment could have. This man knew who Maya was. He had read her work. He had paid attention. Excuse us a moment, Junwoo said, and before either of them quite registered what was happening, his hand was at the small of Maya's back. A thing he had never done before. Guiding her toward the opposite side of the room with the quiet authority of a man reclaiming territory he hadn't realized he'd left unguarded. Maya went with him. She was too surprised not to. When they were clear of the crowd, she turned and looked at him. What was that? I needed to speak with you. About what? The pause that followed lasted exactly 1 second too long. The foundation director wanted to meet you. Maya looked at him steadily. The foundation director, she said, is on the other side of the room, which you walked us away from. Junwoo said nothing. He had built his entire adult life on the ability to speak when it counted and stay silent when it served him. Right now, in this quiet corner of the ballroom with his wife looking at him with that patient, measuring gaze, he had neither a truth he was willing to say nor a lie that would hold up under her attention. She was too perceptive for the lie. And the truth, that he had moved her across the room because watching another man make her laugh had felt, for one unguarded moment, like losing something he hadn't known he was holding, was not something he was equipped to say out loud yet. Okay, Maya said. In the tone of someone filing information away for later, she smoothed the front of her dress. I'll go find him then. And she walked, calmly, back toward the side of the room where Daniel Park was now speaking with 2 other guests, and she rejoined the conversation without looking back. If you know what it feels like to watch someone choose their own peace over your panic, subscribe right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Junwoo is about to feel for the rest of this evening is only the beginning. Junwoo stood with his drink and watched her go. Watched her slide back into that conversation with the ease of someone returning to exactly where she belonged. Watched Daniel Park turn toward her when she reappeared, the way people instinctively turn toward something they were hoping would come back. He stood there and felt something he had not felt since he was young enough to be caught off guard by his own emotions. Something without a name that sat in his chest like a held breath, growing heavier with every second he stood there holding it. The discomfort did not leave for the remainder of the evening. He did not know what to call it yet. He would know in 3 weeks. He had spent 15 years in environments that required him to name things accurately and respond correctly, and he could not, right now, name what he was feeling. The car ride home was the most silent it had ever been. And for the first time, Junwoo was the one sitting rigid, staring at the passing city, aware of her 18 inches away from him in a way he had never permitted himself to be before. The city lights moved across the glass and he watched them without seeing them, replaying the speed with which her face had changed the moment she turned and found him standing there. The way it had closed, composed itself, gone somewhere he could not follow. She looked out her window and thought about the archive collection and the introduction Daniel had offered and the strange, brief weight of her husband's hand at the small of her back. The first time he had touched her in 8 months, deployed not out of tenderness but out of something she couldn't quite name. Something that looked, if she allowed herself to look at it directly, a little like panic. She filed that away too. Something was shifting in him. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. She didn't know yet what to do with that feeling. She wasn't sure she trusted it enough to do anything at all. If you're still here, I want you to hit that subscribe button. It helps us more than you can imagine. It started with small things the way the most significant changes always do. Daniel had attended the foundation event as a consultant, which meant he appeared at 2 subsequent planning meetings over the following month. Maya was present at both, in her capacity as an academic advisor to the cultural committee. They crossed paths naturally, the way people do when they occupy the same professional circles, and the ease of their first conversation didn't diminish with familiarity. If anything, it deepened. He remembered she'd mentioned a particular tea house in Insadong that she liked and he had been to the same one, and they spent 15 minutes comparing notes on it like it was important research, laughing at themselves for caring this much about where to sit and what to order. He remembered her favorite author, a Korean novelist whose most recent book had come out the previous spring. He mentioned he'd just finished it. She told him she'd read it twice. He quoted a line from the second chapter and she finished it without thinking, then looked at him with something like surprise. "Nobody reads that book," she said. "I came across your university reading list online," Daniel said simply. "It was in there. I was curious." One detail, something small she had put together for her students, never imagining anyone outside that room would notice it, held and returned at the right moment. The specific intimacy of being paid attention to without knowing you were being watched. Maya sat with that feeling for a long time afterward, not because she was developing feelings for Daniel Park, but because the contrast was so sharp it was almost brutal. How it felt to have someone actually hold the things you put into the world, even the quiet things. To be reminded that she had been speaking into silence for so long she had half forgotten what it felt like when someone caught what she said and kept it. Their friendship, because that is what it was becoming, existed entirely in the professional world they shared. Foundation meetings, archival research, the common language of people who cared about preservation and history. There was nothing hidden about it, nothing that required lowered voices or careful management. It was simply two people who had discovered they thought well together, and the ease of it was its own quiet kind of relief for Maya, a reminder that she was still someone worth knowing. Word traveled back to Junwoo the way things in his world always did, through people who watched because watching was their job. Shin mentioned, in the course of a regular briefing, that Maya had been seen at the foundation planning meeting and had left with the park architect. Not together. She had gotten a ride because it was raining and Daniel had offered. Practical. Innocent. Entirely explainable. Junwoo said noted in a tone that made Shin very carefully not say anything else. He came home that evening and found Maya in the sitting room reading, her legs tucked under her on the sofa, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. She looked up when he came in, looked back down. No greeting, or rather, just a quiet evening. The way you'd greet a neighbor you passed on your way to the mailbox. He sat down in the chair across from her. He never sat in that room. He had no business in that room. He had his study, his office on the second floor, the kitchen when he needed it. This room was, in the unspoken geography of the house, hers. He could feel it the moment he sat down, the small, particular ways the space had become her. The books arranged by subject rather than aesthetics. A small framed photograph on the side table he hadn't put there. A blanket folded over the arm of the sofa that had not been in the house before she arrived. He had walked through this room 100 times without seeing any of it. He noticed it now because he was sitting still inside it for the first time, and it unsettled him in a way he could not have predicted. Maya waited for him to explain himself. He offered nothing. "Long day?" she asked finally. Not warmly, just the social reflex of filling silence. "Manageable," he said. More silence. She turned a page. "How was the planning meeting?" he asked. She looked up again, more carefully this time. He met her gaze. He was very good at revealing nothing, but she had been in proximity to him for 8 months and she had learned to read the absence of expression the way you read weather, by what wasn't showing. "It was productive," she said. "The committee approved the expanded grant for the archival digitization project. The one I've been consulting on." "Good. Daniel Park is proposing a structural plan for the Jongno site restoration. It's ambitious." She said his name deliberately, not to provoke. She was not that kind of person. But she was done pretending she didn't notice things. Junwoo's jaw was perfectly still. His posture did not change. He said, "I see," and looked at the window. That was the evening she first thought. Something is different. The family dinner happened 3 weeks later. A monthly gathering, mandatory in the way only Sunei could make things mandatory. 12 people around a long table, the cousins noisy, the aunts and uncles negotiating the complex social architecture of the family with practiced skill. Junwoo sat at the head. Maya sat 3 chairs to his right, between Hyunsuk and Sunei, which was where she always sat now because they were the people in this family who actively wanted her there. Daniel had been invited. This was Sunei's doing. She had met him at the foundation event, found him charming, and issued an invitation the way she issued all invitations, which was more like a summons than a request. He arrived with a gift for the table, wine and a small package of candied chestnuts he'd brought from a place near his studio, and he greeted everyone with the ease of someone who was genuinely comfortable walking into a room full of strangers. He sat at the far end of the table. Maya was across the room from him. They exchanged a smile when he arrived, the kind between people who are already friends. Junwoo watched that exchange with the focused attention of a man cataloging a threat. The meal progressed. The cousins were loud. Sunei held court from her chair. The aunts interrogated Daniel politely about his family background and his firm's portfolio, which he navigated with grace. Several times, a question would travel around the table and land near Maya, and she would answer it, and Daniel across the room would pick up the thread of her answer and add something that demonstrated he'd been paying attention to her specifically out of 12 people. He asked her, somewhere in the middle of the main course, what she was currently researching. The question cut across 2 other conversations. She answered with the focused pleasure of someone who loves their work being asked about it genuinely, and they had a brief back and forth about regional court dress traditions that made Sunei clap her hands once in delight. Junwoo had stopped eating. He was aware of this. He picked up his chopsticks again. He took a bite of something. Could have been anything. He could not have named what was on his plate. His attention had narrowed entirely to the far end of the table, where his wife was speaking with her hands slightly. Something she never did around him, he realized. She was always very still around him, contained, careful. Here she was neither, and the man across from her was watching her like her words were the most interesting thing in the room. Hyun-suk, who was 26 and had the instincts of a much older person, leaned slightly toward Maya and said, under the noise of the table, "Your husband has looked at you more times in the last 20 minutes than in the last 8 months combined." Maya kept her expression neutral. "Eat your food, Hyun-suk. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. Eat." After dinner, when the table had dissolved into smaller conversations and someone had put on music in the next room, Daniel crossed the space to speak to Maya near the bookshelf by the window. They were not hidden. They were in plain sight of the entire room. But they were absorbed in their conversation, something about a building he'd visited in Gyeongju, a particular kind of stone that was almost never used anymore, and the rest of the world was simply not where they were right now. Junwoo set down his glass, crossed the room in 12 steps, and appeared at Maya's side. "Maya." His voice was quiet, deliberate. "I need to speak with you." She turned. He was close, closer than their usual 18 inches. She could see the particular tension in his jaw that meant something was costing him significantly. He was not comfortable. That was new. Kang Junwoo was always comfortable, or at least always appeared to be, which in his world amounted to the same thing. Right now he looked like a man who had walked into a room and found the furniture rearranged and couldn't decide whether to say anything about it. "Of course," she said, and then turned back to Daniel. "Excuse me." "Of course," Daniel said pleasantly. He looked at Junwoo with the calm of a man who had nothing to hide. Junwoo looked at him for 1 beat longer than necessary before he guided Maya toward the hallway. She followed him. In the hallway, she crossed her arms and waited. "What did you need to say?" she asked. He opened his mouth, closed it. He had not, it became clear, prepared for this part. "It's getting late," he said. "I thought you might be tired." She stared at him. The quality of her stare was the specific kind that makes people who are usually powerful feel suddenly, groundlessly exposed. "You pulled me away from a conversation," she said, "to tell me it might be time to go to bed." He said nothing. "Okay," Maya said quietly. She looked at him for one more moment. Not in anger, not in contempt, but with the measured patience of someone who is taking an accurate accounting of the situation. Then she went back to the sitting room, retrieved her wrap, said her goodbyes to Sunei and the cousins, and left. That night, Junwoo did not sleep. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and allowed himself, for the first time, to examine the thing sitting in his chest. He was not finished examining it when he heard her door close softly at the end of the hall. What he was feeling was jealousy. He understood this the way you understand something you've been avoiding, all at once with the specific humiliation of being the last to know. He was jealous of Daniel Park, who remembered Maya's favorite author, who made her laugh without trying, who listened to her like she was worth listening to, who had learned more about the woman Junwoo lived with in a matter of weeks than Junwoo had bothered to learn in 8 months. He was jealous of a man for doing the things he himself should have been doing all along. The knowledge sat on his chest like a weight he had no idea how to lift. The next morning he found the letters. He had gone to Sunei's room to check on her. She had a slight cold and he had sent the doctor but wanted to see for himself. She was sleeping. He sat in the chair by the window to wait. On the writing desk beside him, the drawer was slightly open, and he saw a corner of paper in a familiar handwriting. He should not have read it. He pulled out the drawer and removed the letters. 3 of them in Maya's careful, precise handwriting. The same handwriting he recognized from the notes she used to leave on the kitchen counter. The ones he had set aside without reading properly. He read the first one slowly this time. A polite refusal, dated 2 weeks before their wedding. She was honored but had to respectfully decline. The second, a week later, was firmer. She could not in good conscience enter a marriage that both parties had not freely chosen. The third one, I don't want to marry a man who clearly doesn't want me. You have asked me 3 times and I understand what it means to you. I understand this is love, the way you love him, and I am not unmoved by it. I am moved by it enough to make this choice, which I would not make for any other reason on earth. I will try. I promise you I will try. But if he cannot meet me in the middle, please know that I tried. Junwoo sat very still for a long time. The letter did not move in his hands. The thing he had been so certain of, the narrative he had constructed from the first moment her name was given to him, the woman who had calculated her way into his family, dissolved completely and left behind something far worse than suspicion. The truth. She had not wanted this. She had refused it 3 times. She had been brought into this marriage by love for an old woman. The same woman he would do anything for, and she had tried. Every breakfast, every note, every late light under her door, and he had spent 8 months punishing her for a crime she had never committed. He sat with this until Sunei stirred. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Then she looked at the open drawer and the letters in his hand and said nothing for a moment. Now you know, she said finally. You should have told me, he said. You should have asked. Her voice was not unkind. You were so certain, Juna. When you are certain of something, no one can reach you. He looked at the letters. She said she tried. She did. And I. Yes, Sunei said simply. You did. He sat with the weight of this for a long time. When he left the room, his face was composed, because composure was the only thing he knew reliably how to perform. But inside the composure, something had cracked open. And in that crack, for the first time, was something that looked like shame. He had 8 months of damage to answer for. And no idea yet whether it was already too late. If you've ever watched someone realize, too slowly, too late, exactly what they had while they were busy looking away, subscribe right now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Junwoo does next will either save this marriage or destroy his last chance completely. He tried. That was the thing Maya had not prepared herself for. 8 months of nothing. And then, like a light switched on in a room that had been dark so long she had stopped noticing the darkness, he tried. It started the morning after the family dinner. She came downstairs to find Junwoo already in the kitchen, standing at the counter with his back to her, making tea. Her tea. She knew this because he was using her mug, the ceramic one with the chipped handle that she always chose over the newer ones because it held warmth longer. She stood in the doorway and watched him set it beside her usual spot at the counter. And something moved through her that she was not ready to examine. Good morning, he said without turning around. Good morning, she said carefully. She sat down. She drank the tea. It was made correctly, no sugar, brewed long enough to be strong rather than pale. He had been paying attention. The realization landed quietly, without drama, and she filed it the same way she had learned to file everything where Junwoo was concerned, with precision and without expectation. He started eating at the table, not standing at the counter, not disappearing into his office. Actually sitting down, across from her, present in the way she had spent the first 4 months of their marriage quietly hoping he would be. He asked about her research. He asked about her students. Once, when she mentioned a difficult translation she had been working through, he sat quietly and then asked a question that told her he had actually been listening rather than simply waiting for her to finish. She answered everything. She was warm because she was not, at her core, a cold person. But she did not lean into it. She did not let herself begin to hope the way she had hoped in those early months, because that hoping had been the most expensive thing she had ever done, and she was still paying the cost of it. There was a version of her, the one from 8 months ago, the one who had set the table every morning with quiet, stubborn hope, who would have met his effort with everything she had. That woman had been generous to a fault. believed in the good beneath the surface of people even when the surface gave her nothing to work with. She was still in there somewhere. But she had learned, at considerable cost, to be careful about who she offered that generosity to. "You don't have to do this," she said one evening, when he offered to drive her to the foundation office. He looked at her steadily. "I know. Then why are you?" He was quiet. Not the calculated quiet of someone managing a situation, but the genuine quiet of a man who does not yet have the right words. "Because I should have been doing it months ago," he said finally. Maya looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her bag. "The car is fine. Thank you." She let him drive her. But she watched the city through her window the whole way there and said almost nothing. And when he pulled up to the building, she got out with a quiet thank you and did not look back. He sat in the parked car for a long moment after she disappeared through the doors. Engines still running, going nowhere. This was the reality of trying too late, that the effort itself could be genuine and still land on ground that had already hardened. Maya was not punishing him. She was not playing a game or measuring his attempts against some private scorecard. She was simply a woman who had rebuilt her entire interior life around his absence. And she did not know yet whether she could trust what he was offering enough to dismantle what she had built. She had been taken apart once by this marriage. She was not certain she could survive it twice. Meanwhile, Daniel had become a consistent, uncomplicated presence in her week. They met at foundation meetings and crossed paths regularly at the archive building across the city. The introduction Daniel had promised, he had delivered within 3 days. Occasionally they grabbed coffee afterward. Comparing research notes over cups of coffee, neither of them rushed. He was easy in the way that reliable people are easy. He did not require management. He showed up the same way every time, and Maya had not realized until recently how rare that quality actually was. "There is a Japanese restaurant near the archive building," he said one afternoon, packing up after a long session. "Good food, quiet enough to have a real conversation. I want to go over the Jongyo project proposal before I finalize it. I need your opinion on the eastern facade approach. I think I may have gotten it wrong." Maya looked up. "You've already decided on that approach." "I know. That's why I want a second opinion before it's too late to change it." He said it plainly, without flattery. "You have a way of identifying exactly where something isn't working." She considered it for 3 seconds. It was dinner with a colleague who had been straightforward and decent since the first evening they met. A professional conversation over food. Nothing complicated. Nothing that required explanation to anyone. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday works." She told no one because there was nothing to tell. Junwoo found out on a Wednesday evening when Hyun-suk appeared in the doorway of his office with the carefully casual energy of someone delivering news he considers significant. "Did you know Maya is having dinner with Daniel Park tomorrow?" he said. Junwoo set down his pen. "Where did you hear that?" Jiyeon mentioned she asked about the evening train schedule to Jongyo. He shrugged. "I put it together." After Hyun-suk left, Junwoo sat very still at his desk for a long time. The document in front of him stopped making sense. He read the same paragraph 4 times and retained nothing. He found Maya that evening in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long made peace with doing things alone. She looked up when he came in and waited. "Are you seeing Daniel Park?" he asked. The question came out stripped of context or preamble. Just the raw shape of what was sitting in his chest, with nowhere left to hide. Maya went very still. She set down what she was holding. She looked at him with an expression that was not surprise. He could see clearly that she was not surprised, and something in that lack of surprise was its own kind of answer. "You never cared who I spent time with before," she said. 6 words. Said without anger, without heat, without any of the sharpness he might have known how to respond to. Said the way you state something that has always been true and that everyone in the room already knows. Plainly, with a tired clarity that was more devastating than any version of anger could have been. Junwoo had nothing to say. There was nothing to say. She was correct in every direction. He had walked past her for 8 months like she was part of the furniture, and now he was standing in her kitchen asking who she was spending her evenings with, and there was no version of this moment that didn't indict him completely. She picked up what she had set down, finished what she was doing, placed his portion on the counter, took hers and walked out of the kitchen. Her steps up the stairs were steady. Her back was straight. She gave him nothing to hold on to on her way out. No door slam, no tears, not even a look back. Just the quiet, dignified exit of a woman who had already done all her grieving privately and had nothing left to perform. The divorce papers appeared on the kitchen counter on a Friday morning, inside a plain folder, positioned neatly as though they were entirely ordinary. Maya was already dressed when he came downstairs, sitting at the table with coffee, composed in the specific way of someone who has already moved through the hardest part of a decision and come out the other side. "I filed for divorce yesterday," she said. "Your lawyer will need to review your copy and advise you on next steps." He stood at the counter and looked at the folder without touching it. Something about seeing it there, physical, undeniable, between the fruit bowl and the kettle, made it real in a way that 8 months of slow erosion hadn't quite managed to be. "Maya." His voice came out rougher than he intended. She looked at him. Her eyes were not cold. That was what caught him off guard. Not coldness, but something far harder to argue against. Clarity. The specific clarity of a woman who has made a decision she arrived at honestly, after exhausting every other option first. "I am not doing this out of anger," she said. "I need you to know that." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I understand why you believed what you believed about me. I even understand the distance. But I left lights on for you, Junwoo. I made breakfast every morning. I tried to be someone worth noticing in a house where I was being looked through every single day." Her voice did not waver once. "I cannot keep doing that, and I won't." He stood with his hand resting on the folder and said nothing, because everything he could have said would have arrived 8 months too late, which was exactly what it was. She stood, rinsed her cup, set it on the rack with the quiet finality of someone concluding something. "You deserve someone who sees you," she said, almost gently. "I hope, when this is done, you find a way to be that for someone." She left the kitchen. Junwoo stood alone in the room that still smelled faintly of her coffee, his hand on a folder containing the legal ending of a marriage he had spent 8 months refusing to begin, and understood, with the kind of clarity that only arrives after it is almost too late, exactly what he had done, exactly what it had cost her, exactly how much of it was irreversible. He did not sign the papers, not because he had a plan, not because he believed he had any right to ask her to stay, but because something in him that had been asleep for 8 months was only now pulling itself awake, blinking against the light of what it had missed, and it was not finished yet. He just didn't know if she had any patience left for what came next. If you have ever watched someone realize what they had only after they were already losing it, subscribe right now and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Because what Junwoo does next will either be the most important thing he has ever done, or the saddest thing you have ever watched someone attempt too late. He did not sign the papers, but he also understood, with a clarity that had been missing from him for too long, that not signing was not enough. It was not an action. It was an absence of action, which was exactly what had brought them here in the first place. He needed to do something different. He needed to actually do it. The change did not announce itself. It did not arrive in a speech or a grand gesture or any of the mechanisms available to a man with his resources. It arrived in the way he moved through the house. Differently, more deliberately, as though he had decided to finally take up the space he lived in rather than pass through it like a ghost who owned the walls but not the rooms. He stopped disappearing into his office the moment he came home. He sat in the living room in the evenings, present in the common spaces of the house in a way he had never been. He asked Mrs. O one morning what Maya's schedule looked like for the week, not to track her, but because he was trying, for the first time, to understand the shape of her days. Mrs. O told him. He listened carefully. He thanked her. He appeared at the Foundation's quarterly presentation on a Tuesday evening. Maya was presenting a summary of her research on court dress traditions, delivered to a room of donors and committee members. She had prepared for weeks. He knew this because he had been paying attention, and paying attention had shown him the late nights, the documents spread across the sitting room table, the quiet, focused energy of someone building toward something that mattered. He sat in the back row. He did not tell her he was coming. He did not announce himself to anyone. He simply sat there in a dark jacket, without the usual armor of his professional presence, and listened to his wife speak about her work with the precise, passionate fluency of someone who had dedicated years of their life to understanding something deeply. She was extraordinary. He had never allowed himself to see this. Watching her now, in front of a room leaning forward in its seats, he understood it properly for the first time. Not as an abstract fact about her. As something he had been living beside for almost a year and actively refusing to see. When she finished and the applause began, she looked up from her notes and her eyes moved across the room and found him in the back row. She went very still. He did not smile or wave or do anything that would make the moment about him. He simply held her gaze for one beat, then looked away, letting her return to the people approaching her with questions and congratulations. He left before the room cleared, without speaking to her. She did not mention it when she came home that night. Neither did he. But something had shifted between them in that moment of eye contact across a crowded room. Something small and significant, the way the first degree of warmth after a long winter is small and significant. Not enough to change everything. Enough to make her wonder. She did not want to wonder. Wondering was dangerous for a woman who had already reorganized her life around not hoping. But it came anyway, quietly, in the spaces between her daily routines, when she passed him in the hallway and he stepped aside, when she found that he had left the kitchen light on because he had noticed she came down for water sometimes in the middle of the night, when she caught him standing in the sitting room looking at the small framed photograph on the side table. Her mother, mid-laugh, with an expression she had no name for yet. Small things. Consistent things. Things that could not be performed indefinitely without being real. Daniel noticed the shift before she said anything about it. They were at the records hall on a Thursday afternoon, going through a collection of preserved textile samples, when he stepped aside to take a brief call. When he returned, Maya was standing at the window with a document in her hand and an expression he had not seen on her before. Something distant and interior, the look of a person whose mind is entirely somewhere else. He looked at her for a moment. Then he quietly began packing up his section of the research materials. "I think I have everything I need for the proposal," he said simply. She turned. "Are you sure?" "We still have." "I'm sure." He smiled the way he did everything, without performance, without undercurrent. "You have somewhere your mind is tonight. Go be there." She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she nodded, and something in that nod carried a weight of gratitude that went far beyond the moment. He was already heading for the door. Daniel Park was not a man who needed things explained to him twice. He understood what he had seen on her face, understood what it meant, and because he respected her fully and genuinely, he stepped back without making her say a single word about it out loud. No conversation, no declaration, just a decent man reading the room and doing the right thing quietly, which was exactly the kind of person he had always been. 2 days later, Junwoo was waiting in the corridor outside Maya's university office when she arrived in the morning. She stopped when she saw him. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, no particular expression on his face, and he looked, without the suit and the authority and all the mechanisms he usually wore, like someone who had come a long way to say something he wasn't sure he had the right to say. "There's somewhere I want to take you," he said. "If you're willing." "Where?" "The venue," he said. "Where we got married." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. "Why?" she asked. "Because that is where I failed you first," he said. "And I need to say what I have to say there. Not here. Not at the house." He held her gaze steadily. "You can say no." She did not say no. The venue was empty on a weekday evening. Chairs stacked against the walls, chandeliers dark, the ballroom stripped of everything that had made it beautiful on that October afternoon almost a year ago. Their footsteps echoed on the polished floor. Maya stood in the center of the space and looked around her, and Junwoo stood a few feet away and looked at her. "I left this room the moment the vows ended," he said. "I told myself it was business. It was not business. I was afraid of what it meant to stay." He did not move toward her. He gave her every inch of distance she needed. "I came into this marriage having already decided who you were. I decided before I knew you. Before I gave you a single opportunity to show me anything." He paused. "I was wrong about everything, but finding out I was wrong is not why I am here." She turned to look at him. "Then why are you here?" "Because I watched you," he said. "For almost a year, I watched you. I watched you make breakfast for a man who never sat down to eat it with you. I watched you leave lights on and write notes and show up to every family gathering and make that house into something it was never going to be as long as I was walking through it the way I was." He kept his voice steady, although it cost him something to do it. "I watched you stop. I watched you rebuild yourself completely around my absence and become someone even more remarkable than you already were. And I watched you file for divorce with the same quiet dignity you brought to everything else in that house. He exhaled slowly. And I understood that I had no one to blame for any of it but myself. Maya said nothing. Her eyes were steady on his, giving him nothing and taking everything in. The biggest mistake of my life wasn't marrying you. It was making you feel alone after I did, he said. Every morning you set that table. Every note you left. Every light you kept on. He stopped. I kept waiting for proof that you were not using me. I kept telling myself I was being careful. I never once realized that I was the one refusing to see you. The proof was there every single day and I chose not to look at it. The empty ballroom held them both in its silence. I am not asking you to forgive me, he said. I am not asking for another ceremony or anything that puts the weight of a decision on you tonight. I am asking for a chance to show up consistently every day as the person I should have been from the beginning. Nothing more than that. She was quiet for a long time. I need you to understand something, she said finally, her voice low and even. I did not fall apart when you stopped seeing me. I rebuilt. I found my work again, my purpose, the version of myself that does not need to be chosen to know her own value. She looked at him directly. So if I give you this chance, it is not because I need you. It is because I am choosing you. And I need you to understand the difference between those two things. I understand the difference, he said quietly. She held his gaze for one long moment. Then she nodded once, small but certain. It was not a reconciliation. Not yet. It was the beginning of the possibility of one, which was all either of them had the right to ask for in that empty room. Weeks passed. He showed up. Every single day, in every small way, he showed up. He did not make speeches about it or ask her to acknowledge it or measure her response against his effort. He simply continued, the way she had once continued for him, and he let the accumulation speak for itself. He was at the table in the mornings. He was present in the evenings. When she spoke, he listened in the way that demonstrates itself through the questions that follow. When she needed space, he gave it without making her ask twice. One morning, she came downstairs and sat across from him at the kitchen table. Not in her usual spot. His spot. She had made tea, his cup, brewed the way he took it. She set it in front of him without explanation and sat with her own. And he looked at the cup and then at her and understood, without a single word, what she was saying. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something that required more courage than forgiveness. A beginning. He picked up the cup. He sat down. Outside, Seoul moved through its morning the way it always did. Indifferent and bright and entirely unconcerned with the two people sitting in a kitchen learning, slowly and without guarantee, how to choose each other. Some love stories don't start on the wedding day. Some of them start much later, in the quiet aftermath of all the damage, when two people look at what they have done to each other and decide that what remains is still worth something. This was that kind of love story, and it was only just beginning. If the story moved something in you, if you felt every silence and every small act of trying, subscribe right now and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. These stories exist because you are here, and I have so many more waiting for you.